We started working with Mark about 2 years ago, just after Scott Watson, our director curator, came back from the Sidney Biennale. And he said, we're going to do a project with Mark Boulos. And we didn't really sort of have an inkling of what it was going to be about. And we started to research his work, and we looked at No Permanent Address, or no Permanent Address, but the All Solid That Melts into Air, which was shown at Sydney, as well as most recently at the Berlin Biennale this past summer. But I think it was when Jana Tyner received an email from you just this past spring or summer saying, I'm off to the Philippines in the jungle. And these are my vital statistics. If you don't hear from me, this, in the order that I present, you're going to have to contact various people. And we didn't realize how much courage or the sense of adventure that you have in your work. So that was pretty interesting, and we really didn't sort of know what to expect. And emails were kind of scarce back and forth, and I'm sure you were, very busy doing all your filming and your editing. But it wasn't until he sort of arrived about 3 weeks ago that I realized how charming and how open and how easy it is to work with you. So it's been a pleasure the past 3 weeks.
Thank you.
And what's also interesting to me is that your background in philosophy from Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, as well as your master's degree from the National Film and Television School in London, they really come together to produce this really interesting and dynamic way of taking a look at film and documentary and how a person merges all that together. And so as we go through this afternoon, Mark will talk about his work. Feel free to ask questions as he's going through. He's a super easy guy to communicate with. And it will be about an hour, hour and a half long. So hopefully we'll wrap up around 2:30, 3-ish. Okay? So I'll present Mark to you. Mark Boulos.
Hi, I'm Mark. This exhibit presents 3 videos that I made in 2006, 2008, and 2010. The newest video was actually commissioned by the Belkin. Scott commissioned it. It was a year and a half ago.
Year and a half ago?
Yeah. And this is work that I've been doing since I went to film school. And after I studied documentary direction in the National Film and Television School in England. And immediately afterwards I started presenting my work in a fine art context. The Word Was God was my first work after leaving school, and that was commissioned for an exhibition called East International at the Norwich Gallery, also in England. Basically what I was trying to do, or what I thought I was doing, or what I think I am doing, was trying to do a documentary that was not based in empiricism or factual, with this assumption that what is seen and heard is to be believed. It's not a presentation of evidence or facts or it's not trying to convince you of something in particular, but instead I wanted to make it about ideas that maybe aren't in fact true, but are true subjectively. So also to isolate the images and the sounds so that they aren't, a matter of historical record, but kind of transcends somehow the particularities of where I filmed them. So that's what I thought I was doing. I was interested in making a phenomenological rather than an empirical film. And I was also, with this, where I was starting from was, my earliest work was, I started making films around 2001, and I was interested in radical Islam in the Middle East and in American foreign policy, and I was working with Paper Tiger Television and Third World Newsreel, which are 2 leftist video collectives based in New York, and that was before I went to film school. And then in film school I was kind of expanding on those ideas. and always religion and politics were main themes in my work, and they came down to basically to be about miracles and revolutions. And the reason I was interested in that was because miracle or revolution is somehow very cinematic in that it's an event. It marks an event in a belief system or an ideology where an idea is so firmly held that it becomes real. It's kind of forced into the world by the people who believe it. And so those ideas might be contrary to scientificity, scientific evidence, empirical proof, all of that. But so what thought I was trying to do was also make a fictional narrative out of documentary, or not necessarily fiction, this ambiguity where what is the story that is told might be true or might not be true, but it's true for the people in the film. And so the viewer or me as I'm filming it are compelled to give yourself over to a suspension of disbelief that's normally reserved for fiction. That was part of the idea, and also finding different ways to structure films rather than exposition or narrative. And as I started working in galleries, also structuring them according to space, and also the viewer's body in that space as well. The first one was The Word Was God, and briefly I mean, maybe we can watch it. I don't know if it's too loud, maybe we can turn it down, or I'll just talk over it as it plays behind me.
So how did you make the jump between documentary filmmaking and then bringing it into narrative?
It was always, you know, the biggest event was that in 2005, the film that was my thesis film for film school was part of an exhibit called New Contemporaries, which in Great Britain is kind of, it's a selection of graduate work, of recent young graduates. And my work was selected, and so I started working in that context professionally. But even before that time, as I was working in New York, even Paper Tiger and Third World Newsreel always had connections to not the gallery system, but the art world, which is different. I mean, we weren't showing in this kind of commercial context, but like the film I made with Third World Newsreel had its first screening at the Museum of Modern Art for Documentary Fortnight. And I think both Paper Tiger and Third World Newsreel are known within art historical context as well, because they were, it was early video art. In the 70s, they started using video for revolutionary purposes, or using it contrary to the American state apparatus or whatever. So this film was the first film, though, that I made that was commissioned for an art space, and so it was the first film that I made that is on a loop, and it doesn't have a beginning or end. So that was one. I mean, that was one of the starting points. Is how do you structure a film that is actually it's no beginning and no end, and for this. It was two films back to back, kind of revolving around each other. So once one film starts, the other begins. And basically the film is about an old man who lives alone in the mountains in Syria, and he speaks Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, and he lives in one of the last villages in Syria where that is still spoken. The other half of the film is about Pentecostalism, and I filmed Pentecostal parishioners in London who speak in tongues when they pray. So this man is Catholic. Actually, he's from the same sect of Catholicism that I am, which is Melkite Greek Catholic. It's one of the, in the Middle East they have 10 to 12 different small, very old kinds of Catholicism or Orthodox Christianity, and that's what he is, and that's where I found him. I was staying in a monastery in this village when I met this man, and the others are Pentecostalists. I don't know. Pentecostalism is it's only 100. It's now just 100 years old, and it's the fastest growing form of Christianity in the world. It's second only to Catholicism at this point, and it's an outgrowth of baptism, or Baptist ministry, and it was basically started 100 years ago in Los Angeles by a black man who was forced to pray in the back of the church, as all black people were in the Baptist church, and then he said he started experiencing an ecstasy and experiencing miracles and being moved by the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, fainting, jumping, shouting, and then he moved to the front of the church, became a preacher, and started Pentecostalism. And Pentecostalism has historically been had this liberation aspect to it, although more recently, it became recently famous because of Sarah Palin, and unfortunately in the past few years, it's had a confluence in the United States with more right-wing fundamentalist forms of Christianity, but in the beginning it was, or even still, it has some really interesting and liberationist aspects. So the idea was, in the second half of the film, they're speaking in tongues, and in this half of the film, he's speaking in Aramaic. So the idea I started with was, how do you make a documentary about God? Because the film I made immediately prior to this was also about religion. It was about a woman who believed that miracles happened to her in her bedroom. She received the stigmata wounds of Christ. Jesus gave her messages to give to her followers. So that film was, it's called The Gates of Damascus, and that was my thesis film in film school. And that film was basically structured like a passion play. And so, continuing from that, I was thinking, how do you make a factual or a documentary film where you can only film reality, or what is seen and heard, but it's also about God. And I was interested in that because I was interested in, again, I was interested in philosophy, and I realized that the way that most people in the world experience philosophical ideas is through religion. Religion is philosophy popularly expressed. And second, I was interested in this, the fiction of religion and its mythology, and also how that affected me and also my aesthetic. I mean, I grew up Catholic, and there's certainly something indelible about that, not necessarily in terms of what I believe rationally, but in terms of what I think is beautiful and what I think is good, morally as well. So I was interested in looking at that. And at the time I was reading philosophy which said that God is in the same category as language. And when you learn language as a young child, you also learn linguistic structure, and that's your first understanding and experience of external authority. It orders all of your thoughts, and there's no way to escape it once it's part of you. And the theory comes from Lacan and his followers, and it says that the order of symbolic is the order of also patriarchy, religion, law, and God. And so I liked this relationship between language and God, that somehow God exists in and through language. and also that the reason that we believe in this absolute authority is because we think only, we can't think thoughts that are outside of language and is structured from some external authority that seems to be transhistorical and predate us. So I was interested in that, and I was thinking about where this old man was. Is a village that I had heard about since I was a child. My father used to tell me, my father's from Syria, and he used to tell me about it, and so it was this kind of memory that I didn't even remember the first time I had heard it. And I wanted to make something there, and somehow, I don't know which idea I had first, but it fit. You know, whether I was interested in Aramaic before I was interested in this philosophy, but somehow it all came together. And then there was the issue of glossolalia, which is speaking in tongues. And the Pentecostalists believe that when they pray, if they pray hard enough, they reach a point where they are inspired by the Holy Spirit to speak in languages that no one understands but God, and it redoubles the moment in the Acts of the Apostles of the Pentecost, which after Christ left Earth, the apostles, the first Christians, his followers, were meeting and they didn't know exactly what to do, and then suddenly they were all inspired by the Holy Spirit and speaking in all foreign tongues, and then they realized they had to go preach Christianity as widely as possible, so they could preach to all tribes and all languages. That's why they call themselves Pentecostalists, because they're reduplicating that event, which was the Pentecost. If it gets too loud, we'll move out. But so that was basically the idea, and I became kind of aware of them as a movement because I was living in this neighborhood in East London where the movement is huge in Africa and also South America, and I remember walking past a abandoned storefront with a metal grate pulled down and hearing music and chanting, and I looked through the mail slot, and there was one woman preaching alone, preaching to herself, standing on a stage in front of empty chairs and speaking in tongues and weeping. And it was one of the most amazing things I have seen, as just kind of stumbling upon it. And I became really interested in it, and at the same time, I read an article in the New Left Review by Mike Davis, who was talking about Pentecostalism and also, in a different way, radical Islam as being the song of the dispossessed globally. You know, as it was the first article he published for his project Planet of Slums, and the rise of Pentecostalism has coincided completely with the urbanization of the planet. Like, as people move into the cities, these are the people who become Pentecostalists. So it's this interesting, and it's also the kind of most present aspect of a theory of liberation for these people at the same time. So I was interested in how these miracles happen and how they experience their religion and their beliefs as something that is transformative. And so that was the starting point, and what it became. Now, as I was working on it, Pentecostalism is a theology of the Holy Spirit, and Catholicism is much more about Christ the Son. So it became this dialogue or even dialectic between the Messiah and the Holy Spirit in this kind of very theological way. And so this section is represented as a collective, and the other section is represented as a singular first-person narrative, who talks about his own sacrifice and his desire to leave the world, and also it's quite depressed and it talks about this feeling of abandonment. And the way I edited it was to remind us of Christ on the cross, but also it's quite existential. I had, just before I filmed it, I had just seen Krapp's Last Tapes by Samuel Beckett, and it was really influenced by that to make something quite bleak and nihilistic, and at the same time like this kind of confrontation of being both religious and non-religious, because I think what's most interesting about the Christ story is his own denial of God, or his questioning of God. When he's on the cross, he says, "Why have you abandoned me?" So there's this implicit and structural doubt in the center of Christianity, which I found quite beautiful. And some philosophers have argued that that's exactly why the Enlightenment had arisen in a Christian framework, and because there is this kind of moment where even God himself questions his own existence, and there's a weakness to God as well. So that's what I was looking for there. And it also, it reminded me of, my family, and just this kind of, I went originally to Syria to see what I had lost, or what, to find my roots or heritage. And of course, I'm from Boston, from the United States, and my father moved there before he was 20. My grandparents moved to Canada before I was born, and I had this kind of idea of the place, but no real relationship to it. And this man reminded me of the older generation of my family, and kind of how we had left them, and with this section, with the glossolalia, the Holy Spirit, there had been these Marxist philosophers who were talking about Christianity and trying to resurrect or trying to reappropriate Christianity from the right wing, saying, we can't abandon, this is originally a Christianity as Christ had it was a left-wing movement. We shouldn't abandon its legacy for use of people like George Bush, for example. And one of the things they talk about was how the Holy Spirit is, which is kind of the third aspect. There's, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in the Christian Trinity. The Holy Spirit is God within each person, so it's actually a sort of humanism. And so that's kind of, and as they are collective, I think that more expresses a general humanism. And also, as far as the aesthetic structure of the film, I was really interested in jazz music as well, and the film, again, I was interested in ways of structuring a film rather than a linear narrative, and with that, I wanted to structure it musically. And as I was spending time with these people, I realized how deeply related jazz and other forms of American music come from the Black church. And I realized as well, there's this, in their prayer meetings, these prayer meetings last 2 hours, but there is this kind of movement where it starts quite soft and quiet, and then there's a crescendo, and there are kind of peaks and troughs which sound musical, and it was finding a musical logic within that. And so that's how I edited it and edited the sound as well. When I was in these meetings, each person was praying as if they were singing, and there would be some sort of logic to it, but they would each improvise, and they seemed to be communicating with each other at the same time, because the whole thing would happen collectively. And so that's kind of also how the second half of that works, hopefully. And yeah, and then it's kind of structured with these two quotes from the Bible, because it's also, again, about hermeneutics and, interpretation, and the fact that, again, belief exists through words and in words, and without words there is no belief. That's the idea. So it's also, there's the glossolalia, when they speak in tongues, they're actually not speaking foreign languages as the early apostles, supposedly did, but they're kind of speaking what sounds like nonsense, and maybe only God understands. But for me, it's this rupture in logic. It is a real ecstasy where, I believe that they believe, and that they are only inspired to do that. But it's like scatting, but it's in jazz. But it's also, I think, a loss of the rational self and a loss of their own subjectivity. And that's something else I'm interested in all of my work, is this kind of sacrifice of the subjective position for an idea that's higher than oneself. And that sacrifice is not only physical and risking one's life, but also abandoning oneself psychologically. Like I said in my previous film, it was a woman who was speaking in the voice of God. I believe that, she wasn't fully conscious at that time, and it was kind of psychological break. And I believe the same is true of these people as well. So it's this, it is this ecstasy that is somehow overthrowing a structure that constrains them, which is logic, reason, or language, or religion, even. Do you have any questions before we move on? Not at all? You sure? Okay. Well, I want to move to the next work in a minute, but yeah, why don't we just go? This is the film I made next, which is called All That Is Solid Melts into Air. And that's a quote from the Communist Manifesto. And with this film, I think most obviously, formally, it's structured as, again, two films, but instead of circling each other back to back, they are in dialogue with each other. They seem to even be addressing each other, and synchronized, but running at the same time. And they're both independent and dependent on each other. So it's both one and two films again. And this kind of came out of the last work, in part because the last work was about spirit, and I wanted this work to be about materialism proper again. And while the other work was about people being inspired, like what can't be seen, metaphysics coming and visiting people, instead this work is about dematerialization. So the idea is that, when I say dematerialization, I mean the idea is that it's about oil, and how, I was thinking that oil is this kind of, it is the most exemplary commodity because it's everywhere. I mean, most of our electricity comes from oil, plastic comes from oil, everything is oil, petroleum. The film is oil insofar as it's made of plastic and electricity. And so, it seems to exist everywhere, but we never actually see it. So it's totally disseminated into reality and dematerialized at the same time. And I was wanting to look at the opposite ends of that process. And so here we have the oil fields of the Niger Delta, which is the 7th largest oil field in the world, and it's complete environmental disaster. The people who live there are rebelling against the corporations who are mining it, because they are traditionally fishermen. All the fish are dead, or most of them, and they're starving, and there's no economy for them except to break into the oil pipelines and sell what they find on the black market. And when they do that, the police and the military come after them, and so they fight back. Eventually, they became organized, and militias became a movement, and now it's a huge movement. And so that's a movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta. And on this side, I filmed the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is one of the largest commodities exchanges in the world. And it's also, at that point I was interested in futures and derivatives, which are these complicated financial products which we now know caused the credit crisis and the financial collapse. Futures and derivatives are, they were interesting to me because it was this aspect of capitalism which almost no one seemed to understand, which is exactly why they caused this crisis. But it was they were the products that were farthest removed from the actual reality of the material commodity of petroleum. And I liked, for another reason, I mean, Chicago Mercantile Exchange is one of the last, or if not the last, stock exchanges where people trade by open outcry, which is this process rather than on the computers. And I was interested in the way they communicate by this kind of very foreign hand signals, this language which is totally impenetrable. And also the way, again, it's this kind of visual collective. Interestingly, I started filming this on the first day of the credit crisis, and that was a total coincidence. The first bank that collapsed was Bear Stearns, and it collapsed in March 2008, which was a full 6 months before the rest of the American banks fell. And nobody knew how deep the crisis was at that point, but it was the first time a huge American investment bank had failed at that scale. So that was totally lucky. And this, I became interested also in men because when I read about them, and what I liked was their mix of anti-corporate politics. I mean, their leader at that point said that they had declared war on oil corporations. They had declared total war on oil corporations, which seemed completely genius to me. I mean, very 21st century to attack corporations directly without even talking about the state, because obviously corporations are more powerful at this point. And also what interested me in them is that they are inspired by their traditional religions, which make them bulletproof in their battles. So they do religious ceremonies which protect their skin from bullets. And I liked that combination of being completely genius about their political situation and having this fantastic element that sustained the revolutionary practice. So there was this, I liked basically the combination of miracle and revolution at the same time. And yeah. So the idea was also about this Marxist idea of commodity fetishism, where commodities take on metaphysical properties because they eclipse or obscure the labor relations that are actually between people. So that the commodities are, are exchanged with money between people who don't know each other and can't see each other, and so they seem to have some sort of metaphysical import. So again, it was about what can't be seen, and what's the kind of vague and average critique of capitalism is that it's too materialistic, but Marx's critique is actually that it's not materialistic enough. It's like this, there's all sorts of irrational belief in it. And the idea here, I was interested in these people because they have this, quote unquote fetishism in this, very traditional way where they actually tie, religious fetishes to themselves when they're in battle, but they have actually very clear understanding of oil and colonial capitalism, whereas we have, this fetish of oil that seems, we've just kind of take for granted, and we live in this very, we live with blinders and have no idea where it comes from or how it's traded. This is our religion, but it remains a total mystery to us. This determines, our politics and every the way we live. But somehow, they're our idea that they are somehow more superstitious is. I just want to invert that, because for me, they are more rational about, they're more rational and purposive, and have a deeper understanding of their material reality, even as they believe in religion that is not rational. Yeah. Are there any other questions? No. Okay.
Maybe one of the comments. I think this distinction, between them and us, it's a bit crude.
Yeah.
Because we are here, where sort of young, not so much me anymore, but these younger people are sort of intellectual. And I think I'm from Europe, and we have quite a sort of strong green movement. And there has been this sort of consciousness about that since the 60s. All that solid melts into air. I don't know, I read my Marx quite a long time ago. I don't know with him, as a matter of fact. Maybe it's in there, I don't remember, but it's certainly, if he wrote that, he didn't certainly invent that because you find that in Shakespeare, The Tempest, in the early 70s, in his late place. And that's very moving. Let's have a look.
Okay, that's entirely possible. It's I didn't know that, but it's in the manifesto, which was also written by Engels. So maybe it's the English contribution to communism. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. All of this is handheld.
Yeah.
And some of this is on sticks, right?
Yeah.
A fair bit of it. So
yeah.
The decision between fixed placement, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I didn't take a tripod because I had to carry everything I brought to Nigeria. It was a very kind of functional decision initially, so it was basically, it was mostly function over form. Whatever I could carry on my back is, I was in both of these places by myself without a crew. So, I did the sound, I held the camera, I kind of negotiated everything, negotiated my access. So, most of this was on sticks, I think. Yeah.
Could you speak a little bit why you chose the place to use a tripod here?
I think almost everything is on a tripod here. I think honestly,
System in an unstable environment versus an unstable camera position in a very fixed ideological position? I'm just wondering about it as a layer of your work.
Honestly, I don't remember how I made that decision. I could, tell you now what that decision might have been. I see.
I guess I'm more interested in what it means.
And what it means? Well, I mean, for me now, like this is it has a much more subjective quality to it because it's much more like vision, and this is stiller, more objective. It feels more like it feels more distant and mechanical. I was using the tripod in part, also functionally while I was filming it, because these guys are quite aggressive, and when I had the tripod, somehow I didn't get pushed around, and also because they assumed, like when I had a big tripod on, they assumed I was television, and they didn't question me, whereas I had, and so it's more these kinds of functional issues. And also in this section, there are a couple shots which are manipulated, like this one. It's composited, and so I rotoscoped out different figures and recomposited them in a single frame. And I always knew I wanted to do that, and you can only do that if it's a tripod shot. I thought I would do more of that than I ended up doing. So, yeah, the tripod was used for that reason as well. But this, of course, is not in a tripod. This is in a helicopter.
How did you negotiate access? How did you meet these people?
These people, I met in any kind of political situation that has a militant situation. There's also a parallel political movement that is in dialogue with them. So with men, there's not only men, that's a militant situation, but there's also a political movement, and among that political movement, a pacifist movement as well. There's some that kind of don't believe in armed resistance, and some that do. But at any rate, I met someone within the political movement who was living in England, and I was living in London at the time. And Nigeria, being a former colony, has a lot of expatriates living in England, and so my first step was to do research in the Nigerian community in London, and they all pointed me to one man who had been working in the political movement as an environmentalist. He was with Friends of the Earth and so on and so forth. And then I went to meet him. His name's Felix Tuadolo. He was getting a PhD at the University of Liverpool. And then, there were a couple other guys who were professors at Oxford, for example. Very well-educated activists. And when I went to Nigeria with Felix, and through Felix met people who were now nonviolent political activists, but who had been militants, and from them I met the militants. So it's kind of, it's always 3 steps. And then, and because, the militants do have respect for the political activities of the activists, and because I had been invited by Felix, they all knew Felix. He's kind of famous across the country and certainly in the region. He was an activist before the movement became militarized at all, so everybody respected him, and because I was his guest, I had access to them. And then I stayed with them. I was in a village of one of the main generals. There are 3 main generals in the movement, and it's an extremely dangerous region because other than oil bunkering, which is stealing back the stolen oil, and selling it on the black market, the other easiest way of getting money is through kidnapping, and so there is this economy of kidnapping. And so because it was really dangerous to be anything but Nigerian in this situation, but because I was in the village, the home village of the general, I was actually quite safe. So, he was deeply suspicious of me. He thought I was from the CIA, but because I'm American, or U.S. American. And then, I didn't actually film much for the first 3 weeks, and before he actually trusted me. And then I stayed with them maybe 1 month. And he doesn't appear in the film actually. He wasn't too pleased about that. But his 2 assistants he gave me as my minders, and they're the 2 guys who, not this guy, but the other 2 guys who speak in the film were his assistants. And one was the greatest young warrior, one is the greatest young political mind of the village. And so they were with me 24/7, and we actually became really close. I mean, we became friends, and because we became friends, then the general trusted me. You know, they said, "Yeah, this guy's for real." I mean, we still keep in touch actually. One thing, you know, a lot of people ask me, or a lot of people assume without asking me that I told them what to say or that this was somehow scripted because they're so eloquent, but I just want to make clear that although certain aspects of certain scenes are kind of performed, nothing was scripted. They were totally speaking their own words. So I mean, that's one thing I don't do is put words in people's mouths. But for example, the scene, the crescendo where they're all singing and dancing, that's a ritual they do before going to battle, and there was no battle, they just did that for me. I didn't ask them to do that. I said, they asked me what I wanted to see, and I said I want to see Egbisu, who is the god of war that protects them from bullets, and I also wanted to see their guns, because at that point they had negotiated a ceasefire, and they had supposedly given up all their guns. They kept denying that they didn't have any. You know, and I said, well, you know, I've seen some of your guns, and if there are no guns, there's no. You know, and so that crescendo was actually choreographed by them. It was performed for me. So there isn't actually a battle that they're going to. It was just, you know, they were participating in the making of the movie. And actually, in point of fact, and probably not so surprisingly, it was much, much harder to get access to a financial institution. They never told me no. Actually, if they told me no, it was because I wanted to film something in particular that was too dangerous. And it wasn't, it was too dangerous for them. They said, we can't take you there, we'll get killed. You know, this kind of thing. And it wasn't because they were hiding something from me or didn't trust me. So they were completely open. Whereas the financial situation, I had asked, you know, God, half a dozen to a dozen banks for access before I got access to the show. The Chicago Merc is actually where I wanted to film for the various reasons that I told you before. And it was super lucky, again, that they were the ones who allowed me. And only because their press office was staffed by frustrated filmmakers and artists from the Chicago Art Institute. No, honestly, I mean, they had all read the Frankfurt School, you know, but they were dealing with, you know, cable financial news networks, and they were just kind of setting up these people to film. And when they, you know, found out that someone else wanted to come, they all got excited, and so those were the people that snuck me in, and they lied to their boss. No, they didn't lie to their bosses. But I think they were, one of them, the head, was planning on quitting his job, and then he did. And they were really happy that I was able to do it, and so was I. I mean, so that was much, much harder. You know, almost every time I tried to get access to a financial institution, the first answer is no. Because they know that if you're not a journalist, then what you're going to make is going to be critical. And secondly, that every second that you're interrupting anybody who's doing business is costing that person thousands of dollars or somebody, you know, so it's kind of, that makes sense. Any other questions? Or?
I was just curious to hear any information about the oil field
I mean, if you watch the film, you can see some, I mean, quick images of what it looks like. It's just totally miserable. I mean, it's not, you know, maybe there's not like a big, huge spill the way there was in the Gulf, but there's constant, I mean, there's constant pollution. You know, the big balls of fire that you see on the screen are raging all night, all the time in every oil facility. And basically what it is it's natural gas, and they just burn the natural gas because it's not profitable to collect the natural gas, and the only other thing to do with it is to burn it. And so it's just polluting the environment constantly. And, you know, also even at night, the sky is lit up from these gas flares, and that's everywhere. You know, there's not like oil washing up on the shores, but there are oil drums everywhere, and and everybody's hungry, you know. Well, yeah, I mean, people still fish, but they don't make it. I mean, they don't do very well. The fisherman, the guy who's kind of threatening me with the machete, I mean, he explains it very well. He said he'd been out fishing for 3 days and he didn't catch a single fish, so he doesn't have any fish to feed his children. And that's when he says, so I'm going to drop the net and kidnap white people because he has no choice. So that's, I mean, that's the reality of it. People were hungry, there was no medical care. It was very miserable. Yeah, it was dirty. And it was, I mean, the immediate flow station was Royal Dutch Shell, and they've had a particularly bad history there, but it's also Chevron has, but almost every major oil company has involvement in the Niger Delta. It's a huge oil field. So, but I was also interested in going there in part because I was living in England and Holland, and Royal Dutch Shell is an English-Dutch company, and there's this other aspect of the filmmaking I do where, I mean, there's, you know, it's not quite as sharp now, but for a long time there was this kind of cultural critique of representing other people, like, you know, I mean, there is, of course, you know, you always have to be conscious that the person you're representing, no matter if they're from the same family as you, they are somehow other and respectful of their otherness. But there became this very identitarian way of saying, you know, documentary photographers and filmmakers have no right to represent people from other countries, other races, other things. And I don't believe that, actually. And in fact, I mean, I feel like I felt somehow responsible to do it because, you know, because again, everything, my film is made out of petroleum, so this is somehow representative of my own, one end of the process of my production, you know, and also I believe in universalism. I mean, that there is ideas, that there is a truth that is true for everybody, and so, and also that people are at base all the same. So I didn't want to, I wanted to somehow go beyond that. So there's this kind of movement between radical otherness and also universalism at the same time. And for me, there's no real revolutionary politics without a sense of universal humanity. And so that was something for me. No? Okay. Any other questions? No? Okay. In the Philippines this year, it was a commission by the Belkin. I filmed the New People's Army, which is a group of Maoist guerrillas who've been waging the communist revolution in the Philippines since 1970. The Communist Party in the Philippines was founded in 1969 and the New People's Army in 1970. I was interested in these people for many reasons. First of all, because instead of simply making a film that was inspired by Marxist ideas, I wanted to make a film about actual Marxists. You know, the men, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, are not Marxists. I mean, they would be very happy to let the corporations stay just as long as they didn't kill the environment and they shared their profits with the indigenous people. The film I made had Marxist ideas, and instead I wanted to turn that around and actually look at people who were fighting a Marxist revolution. I was interested again in these Marxist thinkers who were talking about the persistence of communism after the death of communism, or there was this idea of the death of communism after 1989 that no one really believes in it anymore. No one calls himself a communist, and even people who were faithful communists, you know, kind of retreated. I mean, the whole left, at least the academic left or the Western European, North American left, were in retreat. And then, you know, there were some of these thinkers were talking about what does communism mean after 1989, and then after the credit crisis and the financial collapse, what does it mean now, again, where capitalism has now lost its sense of inevitability and the facade is cracked permanently. So I was interested in these ideas, and they were really talking about Marxism in a very orthodox way, going back even to Lenin and Mao. And I was interested in showing that in terms of a real situation, in terms of real people who lived it in a revolutionary moment. And there aren't that many Marxist revolutions anymore. There are a few, and this is one of them. And they are orthodox Maoists. I mean, they're straight down the line. And that was also very interesting to me. I first became aware of them in 2005. There was a highly publicized event where they performed the first gay marriage in the Philippines. And the two guys who got married said, "All love is revolutionary, especially gay love. We pledge our lives to each other into the revolution," which seemed, again, totally genius. I mean, super inspired. I sent that article to all my friends. It was around Valentine's Day. It was like belated gay Valentine's in the Philippines. And I mean, it reminded me of something I had read about how the only true love possible is not this kind of romantic idea of gazing into each other's eyes, but instead shared purpose, gazing into the horizon, holding hands with someone you love. So that seemed quite amazing. And I had been sitting on that for a long time, and after I finished the Nigeria film, I decided to pursue it. Luckily, their leadership lived in Holland, where I was living at the time, or I still do live. And the guy who founded the Communist Party and the New People's Army lives in exile in Holland. And he has an office there, and some of the comrades live there as well. And they, through them, I was able to make the right contacts in the Philippines who could introduce me to the people who could introduce, again, it's a chain. And then I eventually found my way into the guerrilla zone. The other thing that inspired me about this idea of these two guys the gay marriage. You know, at the time, you know, being U.S. American, gay marriage was a hugely contested political issue, and still is. It's not Canada, but also I like this idea of, you know, putting love in the center of the revolutionary story. You know, because I think, you know, in Marxist theory, the why often gets lost, and you know, if we talk only about philosophy, or you know, it's usually this kind of economic inevitability. You know, the proletariat contains the seeds of its own revolution, that kind of thing. And I think what gets lost is this feeling of, you know, the reason that it still appeals is moral reason, and that, you know, and it's self-grounding, the way that love is self-grounding. And I like this also, that there's this, I mean, maybe it's aesthetic, or maybe it's emotional, or maybe it's political, but there's a point at which they converge, and it's this sublime that you just kind of feel, where you know, you feel it's true. I think it's no longer becomes theory, and it's not because, you know, all the best movies are Marxist, or all the best philosophers are Marxist, that we believe in it. It's just kind of, you feel it in your chest the way you do love, and I liked that. I wanted to chase that somehow. When I was in the Philippines, I didn't find those guys. One of them has since died, actually, of natural causes. There are other gay comrades who fight together. They exist. I mean, I couldn't go there for safety reasons. My mobility was hugely restricted because it was even more dangerous in the Philippines because it's a guerrilla war, and so even when you're in the guerrilla zones, you're kind of the military. You're being surrounded and hunted by the military, and so the war is kind of constant and ongoing, and it's an archipelago. So to move around requires lots of time. You know, if you take a plane or a car, you have to go through military checkpoints. So the method that we would use to travel was hiring fishing men and fishing boats, and so to get to one place that might have taken, you know, 5 hours by plane and then car would take a day and a half or 2 days, because we'd have to, you know, run along the beach at night and hide in a hut until the fishing boat came, and then sail at night, and then all this stuff. And so I didn't find those guys, and I didn't actually, I found one gay comrade who I filmed, but I was also really interested in telling the story of women warriors, and kind of reintroducing an element of feminism in my work. The film I had made previous to The Word Was God was about a woman who spoke in the voice of Jesus, and that was very informed by feminist writing from the 70s. These kind of feminist psychoanalysts talked about women reappropriating patriarchal structures. So I liked that aspect in that work, but I wanted a more militant feminism. And also I liked this aesthetic of women with guns. I mean, part of this was, you know, I made right after Sydney, I stopped in Vietnam on my way back to Europe, and being US American and having a leftist kind of thing, it was just really inspiring and poignant to go to the memorials and also to look through a lot of their propaganda, because it was incredibly beautiful and really moving, and a lot of what I saw there inspired what I did here. And that the revolutionary propaganda was, I mean, I remember really liking all of the posters of women with guns somehow. It's just, I can explain it better than that, but I think it's really that simple at a certain level. And so this is the first time I'm showing photographs. I took photographs before I started making films, and so this was kind of a return for me to something that I used to do more seriously. And now I wanted to see if there's of course a relationship between filmmaking and photography, but I wanted to see if I could make in a still image something with the same ideas that I was trying to make in a film. And also, be able to do that without time and without words. And most of the images are portraits, and this here was this is kind of a sequence of a red alert meeting. There was some sort of immediate threat that we weren't dealing with. They were dealing with, and I was present for, and so I was shooting during that. That's what's going on in these 5. Then here is the training sequence. Maybe we should move in and look at the film. It's, I think, a little bit dark in there, but.
Pagkatapos mula sa aming bahay from my house, dala siya sa di karaniwan ko. Ang aking magulang ay tinanggal na isang mata. Wasak ang buong ng aming magulang. Tagdat ang tama ng bala ng mata sa kanila. Sa paghahanap ko sa mahabang panahon ng hustisya, ako mismo ay naging biktima at dahil doon hindi ako nagpahuli sa kanila.
So this is obviously on 3 screens, and there is a progression in this exhibit of 2 films on 1 screen, 2 films on 2 screens, and now 1 film on 3 screens. Before I made the movie, I thought that there would be 3 different stories somehow simultaneously playing and then interweaving. And so I always had this idea of using 3 screens, and then as I was editing, I realized it was much stronger for my material to have 1 film on 3 screens. And the idea was a certain kind of hyper-realism. I mean, this is, after, making all that solid melts into air and kind of having, playing with this large installation, what I really liked about that work, for my work personally, which was a discovery for me once I made it and exhibited it, was this aspect of having a really large life-size image and having a body stand in front of it in space. The way it works for me as a documentary is that it's hyper. I mean, for me, I remember exactly being there because it's what it looked like, and I mean, I feel I can step into the screen, and that's why I make these kind of big screens, because I feel it feels even more present, much more so than being in a cinema or on television or something. But I also wanted this feeling of being surrounded. But again, I was there. I didn't have a crew. It was only me, 1 camera, onboard microphone. So the editing is this kind of, sometimes I'll have a scene where I'll have edited it to make it look like I had 3 cameras and everything's happening simultaneously. So it's a fiction of editing. And then often, as now, it will be 1 shot that's syncopated, or there's a difference in time that's, it's producing a kind of a rhythm between 2 images that are sometimes synchronized and sometimes out of sync, and I just really like that. I mean, that's another aesthetic decision, much less theoretical. And here he's singing the Internationale. I mean, this scene, again, there was a red alert. The enemy was spotted just like 5 minutes away, and we thought we were in for a firefight, and so we were getting ready to be shot at. And
That's such an unstable position for you to be in. Like what?
unstable.
Yeah, for you as you're joining on this and then potentially there's
Yeah.
where you can get away.
Yeah.
So what happens?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yes,
it didn't happen. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I would film it.
Yeah.
I was there could have been a firefight, and I narrowly missed one by, this was the one that almost visited us. But I narrowly missed one, and yeah, it was dangerous. And it's not, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to do this again. Nigeria was also dangerous, but it was, I mean, this is also, it's a risk that is not often taken in the art world, but in the documentary film world, it's kind of, it's not par for the course, but there are people who do it, and so. Go ahead.
What is the interest of the word of the kind of erosion? So the way, I think in many work connecting with the third world, let's say, it's very much connected with emotional and illogical or violence, or sort of way expressing their, their unstable sort of situations, framing the Western world. And as a contrast, why do you put also nature too? Why do you put this contrast of the world of the Western as a logic, or maybe mechanical components were functioning, and you don't show? There's many movement also the Western world, for the civil movement, and also many things against the corporations and capitalism and so on. And you emphasize, because even Nigeria, the institution exists, they have a stock market exists, and so
That's
on.
true.
And why you focus on that particular way of making contrast of the other world to be more like native?
That's true. I think, I probably while I was speaking, I overemphasized this idea that somehow, as you also pointed out, that somehow we are more part of this capitalist apparatus than the people who are fighting against it. Of course, I could have in Nigeria or in the Philippines gone to the banks or the financial institutions or the government, theoretically, but practically that couldn't happen because I was sneaking into the country and sneaking out. These groups are highly illegal. And so the filming, if the Chicago Mercantile Exchange could have been anywhere, it could have been any major stock exchange. The fact that it was in the United States was incidental. As far as which movements I'm interested in, I'm only interested in militant movements. And
because, for instance, like Cambodia was very much deeply supported by US at the time of the Clinton, sort of opening the export of the weapons. And it was a part of the weapon industry, like the labor movement, in the South world, to use the weapons to kill people. It was very much strategic plan created by US government. And then, so this is a kind of reflection of the Western world, make the speculating sort of the business creating, and you can see the phenomenon out of this strategic action created by the US. So, like a kind of the one of, it's not a myth, it's a kind of mirror, but it was very much part of the Western instill. They instill this plan, and you see this phenomenon what happening in the Third world.
I don't think that all third world.
No, but that's what I can see through your work as a.
I don't understand. understand.
The more the elements of the weapons fighting, opposed to the principle of the capitalism, so the way of operation to the third world, and then the people who are against it, they are using weapons to kind of a package and that you are trying to express. I'm not criticizing, I'm just curious why you focus on this way of expressing.
Oh, you mean on the militant way of expressing?
Yes.
Because, well, a few things. I mean, I'm interested in militant movements and revolutionary politics. First of all, because
you have a belief of the revolution
happened
with the
because I think it's
military action like a Che Guevara or sort of
or I have a belief in anti-colonial revolution and probably in Marxist revolution and the necessity of violence. And also, I think within the discourse of documentary filmmaking, there's almost all of it is this kind of wishy-washy, liberal human rights politics that I really find quite facile and ineffective. And I think most documentary films that I have seen recently, when they're political, are documenting somehow victims, and I didn't want to portray victims, but heroes. I think it's much. I think it's much, when a photographer or filmmaker goes to a community, kind of, takes people's images and turns them into objects of pity. I find that much more problematic than these people who are. Who I admire, and I think again with the Philippines is again, it's for me, it's like Vietnam in a way. It's a direct relationship with the United States. The Philippines is a former American colony, U.S. American colony.
In the end of the 19th century, the Filipinos, 50% of the entire Filipino are Masmad because of the colonization period. It was what's the name? The McKinney, the one conducted by Mathematics, a very important proceeding for giving the liberation to by the name of the U.S. government, was giving the liberation to the Philippines. So the reality was just to kill everyone, the same thing they did doing in Iraq or Afghanistan, the exact same proceeding.
I mean, in many ways, the Philippines was, aside from the expansion westward and the genocide of the native U.S. Americans, the Philippines was one of the first instances of American imperialism back in the 19th century. Mark Twain wrote beautifully about it, actually.
However, like this kind of sort of fighting with the weapons, it doesn't make the solution for making the situations better.
I disagree.
I'm married.
I mean, I just disagree. I think. I mean, I think that's the provocation in the work is also. I mean, is the necessity in the use of violence, and that's really what the work is about. When does violence become necessary? At what point do people have to resort to violence in order to defend and protect themselves, and what justifies and legitimates it, and what do they sacrifice? Here the women are talking about sacrificing their love, their husbands, their families. I mean, they give them up so they join the revolution. And why? And I think, I mean, it's an open question, and my work starts with the assumption that these people are good and with good intentions. I mean, of course, it's not. The New People's Army. Number one, they're considered or legally a terrorist group according to the United States and the EU. There's a list of terrorist organizations. Al Qaeda's at the top, and then there are 30 others or something. and the NPA is one of them. I think if you watch the film, it's clear that they're not exactly terrorists. And the film is very sympathetic to them, but my films are not factual and they're not historical. I mean, there are of course facts in there, but I subtract and distill, or subtract as much exposition and history as possible, because I want it to be representative somehow of a situation that's, you know, trans-historical. But also, I mean, in regards to this particular organization, the NPA has a really brutal history. There was a moment, and one thing that I wish I had been able to put into this film, but I couldn't find, was there was a moment about 15 years ago where they had purges. There was a witch hunt. They were losing their battles, and there was a paranoia that swept across them in certain regions where they believed that they were being undermined by spies, deep penetrating agents they called them, and they killed their own members. So it was this quasi-Stalinist thing, like they killed thousands of their own members. And I was hoping to find that and represent that as being part of the situation of the revolution, but I couldn't. In part because it didn't happen in the area that I was filming. I couldn't go to the area where it did happen. But also it was long enough ago that the comrades who were fighting had no memory of it. So it was kind of, you know, they had joined after the fact. So that didn't find its way into the film. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just ask you to talk a little bit more about what you mean when you say documentary, because it seems you're also running up against some of the limits of documentary. We want to listen to using all these screens and yeah.
That's a great question. Documentary. I would say documentary is, what I mean when I say it is non-fiction cinema and television. I think that, and you know, more recently, I'm not really looking at it, using that word in terms of, you know, documentary that exists in the fine art context, like mine, or you know, there's a lot, you know, there's a lot of documentary video and photography in the fine art context, but I'm talking more of like the documentary film industry that puts non-fiction journalistic movies on television, and yeah, that's what I mean.
It just seems that although you're talking about, I mean, I totally appreciate the word, it's so great, but it's like a tension between some of the dematerialized things you're talking about and the kind of faith in the image,
right,
and the realistic image that the documentary seems to always have, and even the face, because you're talking about the relationship of the individual to the higher cause, but there's sort of humanist strain of documentary which often concentrates on, if it's not the narrative of the individual, it's the face of the individual. It's interesting. We only have certain tools, right?
Right, I mean, there are only certain pictures you can get, right? No, I mean, I kind of come from that tradition.
What do you mean you went to school and studied?
I went to school and studied documentary direction at the National Film and Television School in England, and my teachers were kind of established BBC filmmakers who, you know, present their films at Sundance and then on BBC or Channel 4. And all of my peers who I went to school with now work for BBC or Channel 4. So that's the kind of, those are the people who taught me how to hold cameras and edit. In particular, Kim Longinado was a big influence on me. She's a major feminist filmmaker who documents the lives of women in various political and cultural situations. So that is, she's one person who had a lot of influence on me. And before that, and I talked a little bit about Third World Newsreel and Paper Tiger Television, which is also a very documentary tradition in the kind of strong leftist activist sense. But even before that, my first job after college, I was working for Errol Morris, who's a cinema documentary. He did Thin Blue Line, The Fog of War. Yeah, he's a major kind of cinema filmmaker. So that's kind of, those are the people who taught me. And then after I went I went to Amsterdam to study at the Rijksacademy, which is a postgraduate art institution. That's I studied with Arno Mick, who does multi-screen installations, and they're not documentary, they're political, but they're fictionalized. But it was then and through that I started thinking about the use of space, for example, and different structures, non-narrative loops. But yeah, I mean, documentary, it's I don't know what I mean when I say I guess the way in which my work is documentary is this aspect that it's not scripted. I mean, of course, many and most documentaries are scripted. Now we know, like 2 weeks ago it came out, that even nature documentaries, they hire wolves to come and feed on carcasses. You know, it's not. There's nothing real. Everything's performed. There's that. We all are aware of those critiques, but this idea that I kind of go to a really existing situation and ask people to perform who they really are, you know, spontaneously and improvise for the camera, and then I ask them questions and ask them to tell me the truth, you know, and hope to hear a truth that I already believe in, you know. I mean, so it kind of is a documentary self-portrait.
I know how you addressed, like, how your work began with, like, interest in the ideas of political Islam. And I really appreciate the work. I was wondering how much the success of the work has to do with the fact that it is addressing what Western political economy has been engaged with, which is this kind of like sovereignty struggles in the Muslim world, by not directly addressing it and by addressing marginal struggles. Somehow it becomes about Afghanistan, Palestine, and Iraq, and also like how sort of like this distance between, say, even outside when you look at the gallery, there's the picture of the mosque up there in the Belkin, right? And it says there once was and wasn't the city of Baghdad, right? Yeah. And then there's your like for us who are used to that billboard up there, is the first time that Belkin has a billboard down here. So there's this relationship between these two billboards right now outside, created between this young man with a gun and then the mosque up there. So I think for me, like, I use that as a metaphor. For me, the work functions somewhere between those two, in that space that is kind of like where if you actually wanted to address, say, Taliban, there will be an office in Amsterdam in which you can contact them, because those people are already heavily sentenced and in jail in terms of like the terrorist laws, right? So there is this marginal space where you can talk about armed struggle, but then the work kind of like unconsciously becomes about much larger than what is actually addressed within the frame here, which is this, I mean, Canadian government is involved fighting not necessarily Maoist or Marxist Leninists, but more similar to the African guys over there. People who are even willing to share profits with capitalism if they want, but they're not, right? I mean, we're militarily in Afghanistan. It's 3 days ago was the 9th anniversary of the Afghan war. So for me, that's the strength of the work also. Part of it is this kind of like...
Of course, I mean, it's partially about Afghanistan and Iraq and Palestine without being about them. But also,
dahil ang anak niyo po ay nasa standing order namin.
I have to say, you know, I'm not a Muslim.
Kamatayan po tapat.
I do consider myself to be a Marxist. I don't know if I would call myself a communist anymore after having lived with real communists and seeing how much sacrifice that entails. But I think my problem with representing the Middle East, and I did make my first two short films were about Al-Qaeda. And no, my first film was about Al-Qaeda that I made immediately after September 11th. I was in Lower Manhattan on September 11th. I took pictures of the World Trade Center falling, and then I found, or I had already made friends with militant Muslims in Brooklyn who were veterans of the Afghan-Soviet War, which basically means Al-Qaeda may or may not exist. It's a loose association of people who used to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And so I knew a bunch of those people. I made a movie about one of them. And I tried to make a longer movie. And I actually met the Taliban's representative in New York at one point, you know, and I was trying to make a documentary. And the problem was that nobody, except for this one guy, would let me film them. And also because I wasn't Muslim and I wasn't Arabic, I am Arabic but wasn't Muslim and don't speak Arabic, they were very suspicious of me to the point where there was a rumor that I was from the CIA, which, you know, possible, right? I mean, from their perspective. Third problem is, I don't believe in what Al-Qaeda stands for. You know, I see, you know, their main three problems, which is, you know, the U.S.-American involvement in Iraq, the Israeli colonization of Palestine. Yeah, those are big problems. I understand those totally. The U.S. presence in Saudi Arabia, fair enough, right? Those are the three structural problems of Al-Qaeda. Their solution of, you know, imposing Sharia across the Middle East and Muslim world, I don't believe in that, and I don't want to celebrate it. And part of the problem of
this is what I mean by this distinction that you then create the space to make this, because if you don't make that distinction, you would not even be able to make this work. But you clearly make that distinction, so then the space opens up for this work, and this work is quote-unquote successful.
But what are you saying, that I should be making a film celebrating radical Muslims? I don't understand.
I don't know.
First of all, I don't think it's possible. First of all, second of all, the problem with, for instance, Palestine is I wouldn't know where to begin if there's anything.
Well, the problem with Palestine is if you make a movie like this about Palestine, you'd be attacked directly by the media. You'd be called a terrorist, a sympathizer. There will be like editorials about you. And you know, it may not even interest curators, because it's a very because we're in. See, that's how I started my conversation, right? Because the political economy in the West is so like invested in that space would not even be there, and that's the power of this work, because it actually sneaks in.
Listen, but I actually did make a film that was quasi-sympathetic with Al-Qaeda. I mean, the film
it's not on display here, right? So that's what I'm saying. There's this ghost of Afghanistan.
I've showed it repeatedly. And the reason it's not on display here is because it's 10 years old. I mean, and it's also, I mean, the reason I departed from that is because I wanted to film. You know, there was the problem I have with that film now is the irony that exists, and I wanted to make something that was much more sincere. The irony is that, yeah, I actually, you know, there is a separation, a gulf between what he is saying and what I believe, and there's not here, and there's not in the film about Nigeria. I believe what they say, and I don't want to. I actually want to make films where I say what I believe, even though, you know, it's not my lips that are moving. You know, I don't doubt for a second anything that they say is true. And there's no, in my mind, I mean, frankly, honestly, I haven't been following the situation in the Middle East closely enough to know this for sure. But I don't know if there's anyone active in the Middle East situation that I believe 100% in. You know, where are there communists left in Iraq? I think they're all gone or Palestine. I mean, there's the PFLP, but how active are they?
Last question.
Okay, I just want to, I guess, get back to the idea of, or just rather go to your education. You studied documentary at the undergraduate level, then you did a...
No, I studied philosophy undergrad,
Okay.
Documentary grad school, art postgrad.
Okay, so the postgrad with Bernard Meek at the Rijksmuseum Academy. So you're in a different context. These films are in an art context. They're in an art gallery. And what they bring is not just the work and the installation, but a different set of eyes, different questions about what we're seeing, what we're hearing tonight. And I guess I'm interested in what you learned studying at the Rijks Academy, making work in an art context, in relation suddenly not so much to your peers who went on to work for BBC and Channel 4, but maybe people like Ulrike Ottinger or Walid Rad and Atlas Group. I guess I'm interested in you as a viewer-reader, making work, but then also in this dialogue with other people making similar work, and what you've maybe learned from that discourse around video installation based on documentary and ethnographic work or research. What kind of a reader are you, and how do you contribute to the conversation amongst your peers?
God, that's a hard question.
Maybe it's an unfair question. Maybe it's a.
I'm sorry. What did you say, Judy?
Well, okay. What are you contributing to the conversation?
Well, I mean, what do I think I learned? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I can identify anything I learned in terms of theory, but aesthetics. I think there are certain influences that are clear to me, particularly Kutlu Gataman, who's also interestingly trained as a filmmaker and became an artist. Again, Arno Mick. And it has a lot to do with not only space, but also the kind of what happens to video image in an art gallery, and the way that there's a certain, I mean, without getting too involved in the discourse of the white cube and the black cube, but there is a certain kind of phenomenological bracketing that exists when someone walks into an art gallery. They are completely open-minded, or try to be as open-minded as possible. It's very much more meditative than any other context. When people are in a cinema watching a movie, they either want to be entertained, or if they're watching television and they're watching a documentary, they want to be informed. But I think in a gallery, you can trust your audience to be incredibly generous and to look for things that other audiences won't, which is not only about the quality of the image, but a deeper reading of ideas. I mean, I think it's coming. I think it's something I learned from looking at a lot of conceptual art, or like the work of my friends who, most of my friends are either conceptual performance artists or filmmakers, coming out of an art tradition. I'm the only one of my immediate peers who is trained as a filmmaker. There's this kind of relationship between idea and image that is, it's much more lyrical and there's more space, and yet the idea has somehow more integrity, and it doesn't need as much explanation. Like it can be, I don't know, there's something much more absolute about it as well. And then in the art context, it's often about image quality and space, I think. And I think, you know, a lot of, and I also think it's a false distinction. Like a lot of, there's filmmaking, you know, I think the biggest difference between filmmaking in a cinema context and in an art context is market. I mean, it's an economy. And as far as the tradition is concerned, a lot of, it's a shared tradition. And it's a lie to think that any artist working with film is not influenced by cinema. And for most of my friends who are filmmakers working in the art world, their immediate references are, you know, Pasolini and Vertov more likely than, you know, Legataman, for example, or someone who is very clearly within a gallery context.
Thank you, Mark.
Yung medyo pula.